Hello student, thank you for tuning to our channel. Today we are still on with our program Knowledge Quest. We are learning about plants, and in our last episode we discussed about the structure of a flower. And we are going to continue from where we stopped. So we discussed on the structure of the flower, parts of the flower, and their functions. So today we want to learn more about the flower and the role that they play in plants. So we've said we are learning biology. And today we want to learn more on the structure of the flower and basically on the function of the flower. So we are still on, our topic is still on plants. Okay, but we are going to measure on flowers. And then we discuss the role of flowers in plants. Okay, so we are going to discuss the role of flowers in plants. Now that we discussed the structure of the flower, parts of the flower, we said the flower has the stamen, the flower has the pistillate, the flower has the petals and the sepals. We also discussed about the male part of the flower and the female part of the flower. So for today, we want to discuss the role of the flower in pollination. So basically, we want to discuss the process of pollination and how the pollination takes place in different plants. So, as on pollination. Okay, so we want to discuss on pollination, and we want to see the role of flowers in pollination. So for us to discuss pollination, we start by defining the term pollination. So we want to define pollination. Okay, we'll start by defining pollination before we see the role of flowers in pollination. So when we talk about pollination, pollination means it is a process whereby the pollen grains are transferred. The pollen grains, they are transferred. So we say pollen grains are transferred from the anthers to the stigma. Okay, we are saying, we are trying to define the term pollination, and we are saying pollination is a process. Pollination is a process whereby pollen grains, so we say pollen grains are transferred from the anthers to the stigma of the same species. Okay? So we transfer pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower of the same species. So we introduce to the stigma of another flower. So we can say to the stigma of another flower so we say of the same. So we say of the same species. So the key word is we are transferring. What are we transferring? We are transferring the pollen grains, and we are transferring the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigmas of another flower or of the same flower, but the flower should be of the same species. So when we talk about pollination, so we are saying we are transferring, it is a process whereby pollen grains are transferred from the anthers to the stigma of the same species. Remember we said the anthers produce what? Pollen grains. And the stigma is the one that receives the pollen grains. So when we talk about pollination, then we can talk about types of pollination. types of pollination. Okay, so we discuss on types of pollination. Okay, so we have two types of pollination. Number one, we have what we call self-pollination. And number two, we have cross-pollination. So we have two types of pollination. We have self-pollination and we have cross-pollination. Now, when we talk about self-pollination, for example, if I have a flower, let me try to draw. So I want to assume this is a flower. And this flower has the anthers. So let me try to show the anthers. So if we say these are the anthers, probably the anthers are mature to release the pollen grains. So we say that if this is the stigma, and then if this is the anthers, so we say this is the anther. So pollen, when we talk about self-pollination, then we say you are transferring the pollen grain from here. So you have the pollen grain from the anthers to the stigma. So the pollen grain is transferred from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. And mostly, when we talk about self-pollination, the flowers that are likely to have self-pollination, you realize that the anthers are above the stigma. For example, if this is the flower, so of course we have the ovary, then we have the stigma. Okay, so most plants that are likely to undergo self-pollination, usually we say the anthers are above the stigma. There are high chances of having self-pollination. So if that is the anthers, then we have another one here. So we want to assume this is the anthers that has the pollen grains. So if you transfer pollen grains from the anthers, this is one flower that has the anthers, which has the male part and the female part. So if this pollen grain lands on this stigma of the same flower, then we say that is self-pollination. So when we talk about self-pollination refers to the process of transferring the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. From the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. So that is what we refer to as self-pollination. So I believe at this point, you are trying to picture what we refer to as self-pollination. For example, if I have this flower, then we are saying this flower is having self-pollination. Then we expect the pollen grains, which are here, to be transferred to the stigma of the same flower. So within this same flower, this is what we are saying self-pollination. You transfer the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower, of course, of the same species. So in that case, we say this is self-pollination. Remember, we said pollination is a process of transferring pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same species. So self-pollination refers to the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. I believe that is very clear, what we refer to as self-pollination. So we move to the next part when we talk about cross-pollination. In cross-pollination, this means you transfer pollen grains from the anthers of the same species but of different plant. So, for example, in this case, I may have a plant, and this plant has a flower. Of course, the flower has the stigma, so we say that is the stigma. Then this stigma, we have the anthers. We have another one here. So we have the anthers. So this is plant a flower from plant A, whereby we are saying you have, in this case, you have two flowers. And the two flowers, they are of the same species. The two flowers are of the same species. So that is just a sketch. So here we have the stigma, and then we have the anthers. So I'm trying to do a sketch. So in this case, this is the stigma. Okay? This is also the stigma. These two flowers, flower A and flower B, they are of the same species, but the difference is they are of different plants, but the plants are of the same species. So that's why I'm using the letters to represent this is plant A and this is plant B, but they are of the same species. So in this case, we are saying the pollen grains will be transferred from the anthers of this plant to of this plant, okay? But the plants are of the same species. It is only that they are of different plants. The flowers are from different plants, but the plants are of the same species. So that is what we call cross-pollination. I hope my students are able to follow. Are you able to get the difference between self and cross-pollination? Okay, I think I can redo that part. We have said in self-pollination, the pollen grains, like now the pollen grains from the anthers, they land to the stigma of the same flower. Okay? They land to the stigma of the same flower. Then, so when the pollen grains move from here to here, then we say this is what? Self-pollination. Remember, it is within the same plant, but you are moving the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma. So we say that is pollination, and that is self-pollination. But when you have two different plants, but these plants are of the same species, it's like now you have a maize plant and another maize plant. So what happens when the pollen grains are transferred from the anthers to the stigma of a different plant, but the two plants are of the same species, then we refer that cross-pollination. In this case, we have plant A and we have plant B. These two plants, they are of the same species. Okay? The two plants are of the same species. Like now you have two maize plants, but they are of the same species. But now the difference is the pollen grains are being transferred from the anthers of this plant A to the stigma of this plant B. Okay? So in that case, we are saying that is cross-pollination. But the key word in pollination, the anthers produce pollen grains and the stigma receives pollen grains. So we say pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same species. Now, in that case, if we were to compare these two plants, then we can ask ourselves, between self-pollination and cross-pollination, which type of pollination is more advantageous to the other than the other? So we want to see what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages of these two types of pollination. Okay, so we start with self-pollination. Now, is there any advantage of self-pollination? Is there any advantage of self-pollination? Having in mind that self-pollination, number one, it leads to self-fertilization. Okay? Student, remember, self-pollination leads to self-fertilization. So we ask ourselves, self-pollination, is it advantageous or is it disadvantageous? But when you try to check, you realize that self-pollination is more of disadvantageous than advantageous. Why? So I want us to list the disadvantages of, so we say disadvantages of self-pollination. Okay? Disadvantages of self-pollination. Remember, we have said self-pollination leads to self-fertilization. Self-pollination leads to self-fertilization. And that self-fertilization has disadvantages. One of it, you realize that due to self-pollination, you realize that if there is any poor characteristic, disadvantageous characteristics, for example, in this flower A, if flower A has poor characteristics, if flower A is having disadvantageous characteristics, you realize that those disadvantageous characteristics, they are transferred to their offspring. So it means it leads to perpetuation of poor characteristics in what? In that flower. Remember, a flower is a reproductive organ of a plant. So if that plant is reproducing and it is having self-fertilization, then the poor characteristics, the poor genes, the bad characteristics are transferred to the offspring. So there is the concept of poor characteristics are passed on. They are passed on to the offspring. Okay? So the plant retains the poor characteristics. That is one of the disadvantages of what? Self-pollination. Number two, you realize that flowers that undergo self-pollination, usually they do not have any hybrid vigor. We say these plants, they lack hybrid vigor. Like, remember when we have when we have genes from different plants, there is exchange of genes or characteristics, which results to a young one or an offspring having better characteristics. But for the plants that undergo self-pollination, mostly you realize that they lack hybrid vigor. They only retain the characteristics that they have. So those are some of the disadvantages of self-pollination. Now, when we talk about cross-pollination, now in this case, you have pollen grains. They are being transferred from the anthers of plant A to the stigma of plant B, yet these two plants are of the same species. What does that mean? It means there is exchange of genes. The genes from this plant will fuse with the genes from this other plant, and the offspring that you produce will be having a better characteristics. Remember, when a plant has a high hybrid vigor, it means it can withstand any harsh environmental conditions. Okay? We are saying when we have cross-pollination, number one, there's exchange of genes. So the offspring, they have a high hybrid vigor. So they have better characteristics than the parents. offsprings, they have better characteristics than the parent. Meaning, in case of any harsh environmental conditions, then the offspring can be able to survive, can withstand any environmental conditions that are very harsh. So those are the disadvantages for self-pollination and advantages for cross-pollination. I think we can do a bit of it. So we have said for the self-pollination, it is more over disadvantages. But in cross-pollination, so we are saying in cross-pollination, it is more advantageous, okay? It is more advantageous. We've said, number one, there is exchange of genetic material, exchange of genes, or we say genetic material, which resulting, so we say that one results into a higher, resulting to a higher hybrid vigor. Okay? So having a high hybrid vigor, this one, due to cross-pollination, you find that the offspring, okay, can withstand harsh environmental conditions. Okay? They have better characteristics. So basically, that is what we refer to pollination. So at this point, we have defined the term pollination. We have given the types of pollination. We have stated the advantages of cross-pollination and the disadvantages of self-pollination. Stay tuned. We are going for a short break. Thank you, students, for staying tuned. Before we went for a break, we were discussing on pollination, and so far we have defined the term pollination. We said pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. Now, in this case, we said we have two types of pollination. We have discussed on self-pollination and cross-pollination. We said in self-pollination, we transfer pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of the same flower. But in cross-pollination, we said we transfer pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of different flower, but of the same species. So the plants or the flowers should be of the same species. And so far, we have discussed the disadvantages of self-pollination. We have said that poor characteristics, they are passed on from one generation to the other. So you find that that one leads to lack of hybrid vigor. So such organisms, they have poor adaptive characteristics. So when we talk about cross-pollination, we said in cross-pollination, it is more of advantageous because there is exchange of genes that results to a higher hybrid vigor. And as a result, you find that the offspring, they have a better ability to adjust to any adverse environmental conditions. So now we want to proceed to the agents of pollination. Once we understand what is pollination, then we now move to the agents of pollination. Who is that? Who is involved in transferring the pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma? So we ask ourselves, who are the agents of pollination? So we ask ourselves, and answer the question on agents of pollination. Who are the agents of pollination? Now, remember last time when we were discussing on the structure of the flower, we said that most of the flowers, their petals are colored so as to attract the insects. So you realize that when you talk about agents of pollination, number one, we have wind as an agent of pollination. So we are going to see the characteristics of flowers that are pollinated by wind. Then number two, we have insects. Insects, they play a major role in pollination. Most of the flowers, they are insect pollinated. And lastly, we have birds. Okay? We have some birds that also play a role in pollination. So we are going to see which are these adaptations of various flowers to their mode or to their agent of pollination. So maybe we can start with the wind-pollinated flowers. So we talk about, okay, we said number one, we have wind, we have insects, and number three, we have birds. So we want to discuss on those adaptations of flowers to their agent of pollination. So we start with wind-pollinated flowers. Okay? Wind-pollinated flowers. Now, the wind-pollinated flowers, we also refer to them as, let me just write here, another name for wind-pollinated flowers, we say anemophilous. Okay? Anemo means wind. So anemo means wind. So these are insects that are pollinated by wind. Insects that are, these are flowers that are pollinated by wind. So remember we are discussing on agents of pollination. So we are saying when we talk about wind-pollinated flowers, we also refer to them as anemophilous, meaning anemo means wind. So these are flowers that are pollinated by wind, okay? Flowers that are pollinated by wind. An example, so I'll pick one example, and that example will represent all others. So example we have is maize. Okay? We have maize, and if I was to draw the structure of a plant of maize, probably I will say, if this is maize, what do we have here? We have the roots, we have the stalk, and probably somewhere here, this is where we have the maize cob. Let me say this is the maize cob. This is just a sketch. And then probably up here, this is where we have the male part of the flower. So this is just a sketch. So this is just a sketch. So I want to assume that this is the maize cob. I want to assume this part, we call it tassel. So this is the tassel. And then this is the maize cob. Okay? Remember, we are trying to discuss on wind-pollinated flowers. Wind-pollinated flowers. And I've picked an example of a maize plant which has flowers. So this forms the, so we say this one forms the male part. So this one forms the staminate. Okay. Then this one forms the pistillate. Of course, when I talk about pistillate, I refer to the female part. So in a way, this is the female part of the flower. and this is the male part of the flower. Now, remember what we said. The male part of the flower, this is where the pollen grains are produced. This is where we have the anthers, which produce the pollen grains. And pollen grains are the male part of the flower. Then we'll talk about the pistillate. Pistillate consists of female part, where we have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So this is where we expect fertilization to take place. Now, if I can check with me here, I think I have the male part of the maize. You know, we want to understand how is this flower, how is it adapted to wind pollination? How is it adapted to wind pollination? So this part of the maize, this is what we refer to as the staminate. Staminate means the male part of the flower. Remember we said the staminate consists of the anthers and the style. So the anthers and the filament. So the male part, we said it consists of the anthers and the filament. And it is at the anthers that we produce what? We produce pollen grains. So with me here, I have the tassel. So this part forms the staminate. And the staminate, this is where we have the anthers that produce the pollen grains. So if you can check with me, this is where we have these are the anthers, okay? And usually they produce the pollen grains. And if you are very keen, you realize that anytime there is flowering in maize, you always see the pollen grains being carried by wind. They are always carried by wind. So if I can try to pick some, of course, those are anthers that are producing the pollen grains. So pollen grains, you usually find them in the anthers. So you realize that the pollen grains, when they are produced, they are very light. They are very small and very light, such that if they are blown by wind, they can be easily carried. For example, if I was to blow these ones, we can see they can be carried by wind easily, like, see? Okay? So that means they are light. They can easily be carried by wind. So this is where we produce the male part of the flower. So I've said that usually the pollen grains, they are very light. They are less sticky. They are not sticky in the sense that they can easily be carried by wind. So anytime there is flowering in maize, you will be able to see the pollen grains all over because they can easily be carried by what? By wind. So you can see in case of any wind, so you can see there is what? The pollen grains can be easily carried. So we are saying that in wind-pollinated flowers, an example is the maize plant. They produce pollen grains that are very small in the sense that they are light and they can be easily carried. Then if you realize that wind-pollinated flowers, in wind-pollinated flowers, their petals, they are dull. Huh? Remember we said in insect-pollinated flowers, the petals are usually brightly colored to attract insect. Like now here I have an example of an insect-pollinated flowers. So if I look at this part of the flower and this one, what do we see? This one is colored. Remember we said colored, the petals are colored. Why are the petals colored? To attract insects. To attract insects. Remember insects always, they move from one flower to the other in search of nectar. They move from one plant to another in search of nectar. So you realize that those flowers, mostly they are what? They are scented. Unlike these flowers. So if you talk about this one, number one, we see it is very dull. There is nothing attractive. Okay? There is nothing attractive to this flower, this male part of the flower. There is nothing that is attractive, so usually we say their petals are very dull, very dull. They cannot attract insects. Then when we talk about the pollen grains, we have said the pollen grains, they are usually produced in large numbers, okay? Pollen grains are usually produced in large numbers. So if you check on this, the pollen grains, they are usually in the anthers. So like you see, already the pollen grains have been carried away by wind. So pollen grains, always we say they are produced in large numbers. Why are they produced in large numbers? Remember, these pollen grains will be carried, will be swayed or swept by wind. So we want to increase the chances of what? Pollination. If you have a higher chances of pollination, then there is a higher chances of fertilization. Remember, there is no fertilization without pollination. So we say the pollen grains, they are they are produced in large numbers. Number two, we have said they are very small in size. They are light, so that they can be easily be carried by what? By wind. So I want us to list now the characteristics of a wind-pollinated flower, okay? You want to list the characteristics of a wind-pollinated flowers. So we said we are going to use an example of, we will use an example of maize that is pollinated by wind. So we want to give the characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers. Okay? Students, we want to list the characteristics of wind-pollinated flowers. Number one, from the look, we have said these flowers, their petals are very dull. So there is nothing that is attractive to these flowers. So number one, they have dull petals. So if they have dull petals, then it means they are not attracting any agent of pollination. So it means that flower must develop another mechanism of pollination. So that is why now you realize that the wind-pollinated flowers, because they are dull, they cannot attract any agent of pollination. So they have developed a mechanism in such a way that they do what? Number two, they produce pollen grains that are, number one, they are light, okay? The pollen grains are light. Light means they can easily be carried by wind. Number two, these pollen grains are produced in large numbers. So they are produced in large numbers. Why are they produced in large numbers? We have said they are produced in large numbers to increase the chances of fertilization, increase the chances of pollination. We said it is through pollination that we expect to have fertilization. So these pollen grains, they are not sticky. They are not sticky. They are less sticky. So in other words, they are not. If they are, we say they are less, or they are not. They are not sticky. So the pollen grains are less, or they are not sticky. Okay? So remember, we want these pollen grains, the moment they are released, they are easily carried by wind. We want them to be carried for a longer distance so that we have pollination. Now, another characteristic of these flowers, number three, so we have talked about the petals being dull. We have talked about the pollen grains being light and being produced in large numbers. But remember, we didn't talk about this part of the plant. Okay? Remember, we were discussing a maize plant, which is giving us an example of a wind-pollinated flower. Maize, they have flowers that are wind-pollinated. Now, we said this is the female part of the flower. This is the staminate. sorry, this is the pistillate. Pistillate means the female part of the flower. So we expect when the pollen grains, they do what? They are produced at the anthers. We expect them to land on the stigma. Okay? So mostly you find that the stigma, this part of the flower that we call the stigma, so you find that the stigma, they are usually outside the plant, the flower. Like now, if I was to have this, you find that the stigma, this part of these ones, they are usually outside the flower. Why are they outside the flower? So that they can easily receive the what? The pollen grains. And remember, they are also sticky. For these ones, they are sticky. Remember, they have to receive the pollen grains. The pollen grains have to stick on the stigma for them to move all the way to the ovary for fertilization. So we are saying for the part of the stigma usually they are featherly, okay? Stigma, they are featherly. That's why you can see this part. These ones are the ones that form the stigma. They are usually featherly, okay? And usually they hang outside the flower. The stigma hang outside the flower. Why do they hang outside the flower? So that they can easily receive the pollen grains. Then you realize that for the anthers, that is the male part of the flower, you realize for them the filament of that flower, usually they are very weak. They can easily be swayed by slightest amount of wind. So usually we say they are weak, they are loosely attached to the flower, so that they can easily be swayed by wind. In that sense, the pollen grains on the anthers can easily be thrown away by wind. They can easily be carried by wind. So basically we are saying on wind-pollinated flowers, yes, the petals are dull. They may not attract the agents of pollination, but they have developed their own mechanism of pollination, whereby we have said the pollen grains, they are very small, they are light, and they are produced in large numbers. Number two, we have said the filament is loosely attached to the flower so that it can easily be swayed by the slightest amount of wind. And in that way, the pollen grains can easily be carried. Then we have said the stigma of the wind-pollinated flowers, we said are this part. This is what forms the stigma. Usually they are outside the flower. And we have said they are sticky and they are outside the flower so that they can easily receive the pollen grains. And we said they are sticky so that they can stick the pollen grains the moment they land on the stigma. So basically for today, we have discussed on definition of pollination, types of pollination, and how flowers that are pollinated by wind, how they are adapted. And we have said for the wind-pollinated flowers, we said they are also known as anemophilous and mophilous flowers because they are pollinated by wind. And we have given maize as an example, a maize flower as an example of what? As an example of a wind-pollinated flower. And we have said this part of the maize is what forms the staminate, the male part of the flower. While this part of the maize is what forms the pistillate part of the flower. Pistillate, we said, is the female part, and this is the male part. So we have the male part that produces the pollen grains, and we have the female part that has the ovules that must be fertilized. So basically for today, we have discussed on wind-pollinated flowers. Join us in the next episode. We will be discussing about insect-pollinated flowers. See you then.